Very, very welcome everyone to our annual geography lecture. It's one of those occasions in the year that makes me very proud to have the role that I still hold as head of discipline in geography. I'm Iris Möller and I'm Professor of Geography and Head of Discipline here in Trinity in geography. And these occasions are always wonderful because they bring us all together, but they also get a lot of you in from the outside to get a bit of exposure to some of the interesting research and questions that we address within our discipline of geography. And so it's really wonderful to see you here on this cold February evening. So our speaker this year is someone who I've been really interested in kind of reading a little bit about, because he sort of epitomizes for me one of the people I have always admired and seen as the sort of forefather of the discipline of geography. And that was someone who looked 200 years ago or so at the interaction between our land use and land use change particularly, and the climate. And clearly in that day and age this was linked to exploration, and this was particularly someone who travelled to South America and noticed that the deforestation of the Amazon potentially had an impact on the climate. And for someone to recognise that so long ago, that there's a connection between land use and climate, has really sort of left an impression with me. And that of course was Alexander von Humboldt, who some kind of see as the forefather of environmental science, or in my case I really see him as inspiring the pathway that geography took. And so geography nowadays of course still looks in many ways at this interaction between the landscape, the land use and the climate. And this is also what Professor Mark Friedl does, who has come to us from the University of Boston, where he's director of the Center for Remote Sensing at the Department of Earth and Environment. And he is also the William Goodwin Aurelio Professor of Mathematics and Sciences. I didn't know who William Goodwin Aurelio was until just now.
Neither did I for one.
And I was pleased to find out that neither did he. But I did want to now mention this title because apparently it was in a competition within the university that anyone could have got this recognition with this title. And so those in the mathematics and sciences might have been a bit miffed that this went to a geographer, but I'm very proud that it is, so I did have to mention that here today. Now, Mark has a long history and career in remote sensing of the environment, and it's an area where we've really seen phenomenal developments over recent decades. A friend of mine once described it as sort of a dripping tap with one image from satellites every 10, 20 years. And now the tap is on full whack and we're getting snowed in with images and data, and we're needing to use AI to process it and so on. So Mark completed his undergraduate degree in physical geography at McGill University and then went on to do a master's and a PhD. He was in geography at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and has been awarded several fellowships, including the Charles Buller Fellowship in Forest Research at Harvard. He's worked extensively with NASA since 2004, included on MODIS, the Landsat 8 science team, and the Land Science Data Analysis and Multidisciplinary Research team. And he's been associate editor of several journals, including the Journal of Remote Sensing of the Environment, which of course is one of the main remote sensing journals. He's also a highly cited researcher on Clarivate, recently in 2022 awarded that title, and has over 46,000 citations, which is very impressive. His work primarily focuses on using remote sensing to examine biophysical patterns and processes at the Earth's surface. And of course, particularly interested in this interconnection between the land cover and the climate and climatic processes, but also ecosystem properties and the climate and so on. And of course, human activities raise their heads in all of these kinds of spaces, and how human activities are shaping the planet and affecting our global biosphere then also feeds into what Mark does. So he's also a grandnephew of the person who has bequeathed Trinity with the collection of books and journals And we're now held in the space that we're going to for our reception afterwards. And that is Walter Freeman, who of course was first head of discipline or professor of geography here in Trinity. So we will welcome you all at 7:30 to that reception. And before I let Mark start his talk, just to thank everybody also for organising our event today. Apologies for the change in venue. We've had, you'll meet our undergraduate students who are there for you to enjoy the drinks at the reception afterwards. So thanks very much to them. Thanks particularly to John for, where are you, John? For John for getting Mark over to us and making that connection, all the organisation behind this. We've got filming assistants, we've got lots of people who were carrying things around just now in order to make this happen. And thanks very much to all of you for coming today. So before further ado, Mark, over to you. But Mark's going to talk to us about making sense of pixels at planetary scale using Earth observation to measure and monitor change in terrestrial ecosystems at regional and global scales. I can't think of any more geographical title than that, Mark.
That's a lot of words. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. Very generous. I think it's the first and last time I'll ever be compared to Alexander von Humboldt. It's really, really nice to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the hospitality. Thank you, John. It's great. It's really nice to be. It's nice to get out of the United States right now. Let me put it this way. The city is lovely, and there's just a great energy here. So it's really great to be here. My screen is frozen. Oh, there we go. So a little bit embarrassing because to introduce myself, I copy and pasted from my own website. But as Iris just described, what I'm fundamentally interested in, what we do in my group is we're interested in processes at the land-atmosphere interface. We're interested in how those processes propagate into the atmosphere and the climate system, and how the climate system impacts land surfaces, terrestrial ecosystems in sort of bidirectional directions. And we do that in two ways. We use a lot of remote sensing because we work at scale, but we also use models. We try to integrate those observations into models. We use field data, the whole work. So what I've got today in terms of an outline, I'm going to apologize, a little bit of a random walk, but I'm going to start just sort of, I want to set the stage, talk about Earth observations and the biosphere for a few minutes. From there, partly because this is a geography seminar, most of what I do work is on the natural science side, but we did some work a few years ago looking at linkages between agriculture and seasonality and atmospheric CO2 and sort of fingerprints and so I wanted to include sort of a human dimension of that. From there, the thing I'm going to talk about the deepest is some work we've been doing really for 6, 8, 9 years now on high latitude change and impacts of climate change in Arctic and boreal ecosystems. And then I'll finish up, depending on how my timing goes, with a project that we've been working on again for a bunch of years, just trying to use the satellite archive to characterize and quantify how terrestrial land areas have changed over the satellite record, which at this point is quite extensive. So having set that up, let's start with Earth observations in the biosphere. So the starting point here, I asked for a laser pointer. This is way better. I'm really happy about this. So many of you, some of you I'm sure are familiar. Landsat is sort of the oldest and best record of change on the planet. All right, and so it started in the 1970s with something called the Earth Resources Technology Satellite. We don't really use those. The data are there, but they're not super usable. But starting in the early 1980s, NASA launched these instruments called the Thematic Mapper and Enhanced Thematic Mapper, and it really sort of improved the quality of the data. And the key thing here that I want to point out is at the start of the record, the population of the Earth is about 4.6 billion. Now we're on Landsat 9, which was launched a couple of years ago, and we're up to 8 billion people. So it's a record of the planet during which there's been enormous change and enormous pressure on the environment. In parallel with that, early in the 1990s, a group of people at NASA, kind of visionary, had this notion of building this thing called an Earth observing system, right? And so the idea is we had Landsat, but what we really want to understand, we want to understand how the whole system is working. And so as a consequence of that, this is a whole timeline of satellites that NASA has built and flown. Each of these, by the way, not all of them, but many of them on the order of $1 billion to build and fly. It's just been an enormous investment and a highly successful one, to the point where now this is the fleet. I think it's on order 27 satellites on orbit right now, continuously collecting data. Some on the space station, some in development. And these guys, this is both a great thing and a bit of a dilemma, which is these guys are all in what are called extended operations. All right, so what that means is most of these are built to have a specific design life, typically 5 or 6 years. A few years ago, I was privileged to be on a panel, and one of the things NASA does is, because it costs hundreds of millions of dollars to keep these things running, right? And so they have to make decisions about where to put money. So I was on a panel where we were reviewing these missions, how they're working, all this kind of stuff, and it's really remarkable, the sort of the engineering that goes into building these things. I'll talk a little bit about some data off of this guy, Terra. Terra was launched in 1999, it's still flying. 6-year design life, it's 26 years later, it's still flying. And the engineering involved, one of the things they do with Terra, just in terms of, just to give you an example, really high attention to calibration. These are measurements, right? And they rotate the spacecraft once a month, pointed at the moon, to get a stable measurement with no atmosphere or anything in the way to calibrate it's really phenomenal. They do collision avoidance. There's always debris floating around up there, collision avoidance. It's really remarkable what NASA does. And then of course there's ESA, which has jumped into the remote sensing business in a really big way over the last 10 years, and very, very successfully. I mean, the instruments are beautiful, the data is fantastic. And so what this means is that we have this constellation, and I'd like to make a couple of key points of some key words up here. Coordinated, oh boy, it's walking. Coordinated, systematic, I'm pretty sure that says calibrated behind the Zoom logo, right? But this is really important, because what I like to emphasize with folks who aren't that familiar with remote sensing is this sort of notion that they're pictures. They're not pictures, they're measurements. They're physical measurements. We're measuring radiance in the electromagnetic spectrum coming off of the surface. Some of them are active sensors. We're propagating electromagnetic radiation into the atmosphere, onto the surface, and seeing what comes back. And from that, we're inverting those measurements to measure physical quantities in the Earth system. And so I like to say data, not pictures, measurements, not magic. There's a lot of people that think remote sensing can do magic, and I assure you it cannot do magic. There's many things we can't do. But day to day, things like weather forecasts, like the weather forecasts on your phone, all those, like the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting, ECMWF, where a lot of our forecasts come from, they're assimilating all these data on a continuous basis. And these measurements have qualitatively, dramatically improved the nature of those forecasts, our ability to predict and forecast things like hurricanes, fires, all that kind of stuff. It's really, in addition to the science, there's been really a profound impact on the environment. And the other big thing about this is we're getting time series, right? So this is some work that former PhD student, postdoc Min-Kyu Moon did with me. I think he's quite frustrated me because I'm sitting on his manuscript. I have to get to work on it. But really, really quickly, this is time series, right? So what am I showing you here? What we've worked on quite heavily in my group are ways to measure the timing, length, duration, and variability in the growing season of terrestrial vegetation. Right? So what we've got from MODIS, this instrument that's on board this platform called Terra and another one called Aqua, is now a 22, 23, 24-year record, daily measurements of vegetation activity. All right? And so what these plots are showing, these are trends in the timing of green up. Right? So that's when the leaves come out, green down, when they senesce. Take the difference between these two, that's your growing season length. Here, these are measures of overall greenness. maximum greenness, which is how green it gets, how seasonal, the amplitude, and then this is integrated. It's basically the product of this guy and this guy. Right. And so what do we see? Basically, the short story here is over the last 2 decades or so. Uh-oh. That's not good.
It's conjunctive, is it?
We had to set this up on a hotspot on my phone.
If you just press points, maybe it goes to that.
Close it?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
All right.
Yes. Do it.
We have the recording in the background. Yeah.
All right, so sorry. So, long story short, we have this record from the satellite record from MODIS that is giving us insight into how the dynamics in the growing season are changing over time. And what we can see is it's not huge, but it's also a relatively short record. We're seeing, you guys can't see this, but that's about, the growing season is getting longer by about 2 days per decade, which is not nothing. And it's getting greener, right? And that's in response to changes in the climate system and things like increased CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. All right, here's another example. This is, many of you may be familiar with this one. This is Global Forest Walk. This is Matt Hansen's work at the University of Maryland. They basically took the Landsat record, so a 40-year record, and they have mapped all of the disturbance and deforestation on forests exclusively at 30-meter spatial resolution across 4 decades. And what you can see is that they changed the color scheme on me. So I'm a little bit, I think the pink here, this pinkish purplish color, my wife tells me I don't know the difference between pink and purple, so forgive me. But this color,
Yeah.
managed forest, you can see arc of deforestation in Africa, Asia, tropics, fires, all this kind of stuff. But the main point here is just the extent and magnitude of change. I mean, forests are dynamic, massively dynamic. A lot of them being modified by humans, but a lot of it, as I'll talk about later, is just fire. There's just a lot of fire on the planet. And as you may know, there's a lot more fire these days. All right, so connecting this to the types of things I'm interested in, this is a picture I took from the top of a walk-up tower at the Harvard Forest, which is a research site about 75 miles west of Boston. When I got a job offer at BU, my advisor said to me, "Oh, you can go do work in the most overstudied forest on the planet," which is kind of an accurate characterization, but it also has a remarkable record. And among those records, this, you can't really see it, there's a little dot here, that's something called the EMS tower, the Environmental Monitoring Station, and it is the longest continuously running eddy covariance site on the planet. And they pioneered this technique, a guy named Steve Wassey. And so what this is measuring, the eddy covariance is a technique, it's a micrometeorological method where you measure high frequency, the 3-dimensional variability in wind fields, and adjacent to that you measure the high frequency variability in concentrations of trace gases. You look at the covariance between those two terms and you can back out the flux. Right? And so this is the sort of established way to measure fluxes of carbon or other methane, water vapor in and out of terrestrial ecosystems. And you can see negative here are fluxes in. So you can see every summer, Harvard Forest, the forest is pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, and then the wintertime respiration release back. Right? So this is great. The challenge here is that there are on order, I don't even know if it's growing, but it's probably 600, 700 towers globally. They're point-based measurements, right? And so what we really want to do is be able to link the observations we're getting to space and be able to upscale those measurements, the in-situ measurements, to larger scales to be able to understand how changes that we're observing in the terrestrial ecosystems globally are propagating through the carbon cycle, propagating into climate. All right, so here's a graphic showing you the global carbon cycle from the global carbon. This is these sort of state-of-the-art in terms of estimation of global carbon budget. I'm sure many of us know this already, but what do we know? We know that currently we are emitting about 9.7 gigatons of carbon per year into the atmosphere, right? In addition, that's burning fossil fuels. About 1.1 gigatons from land use, land cover change. Right? That is basically mostly clearing of tropical forests. They clear them, they burn the forests, emits carbon into the atmosphere. The sort of interesting part is if you look at the rate of accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's about 5.2 gigatons per year. Right? So the accumulation rate is not the same. It's only about 50% of what we're pumping into the atmosphere. Right? And so where is that going? It's going into the biosphere. About 2.9 gigatons going into the oceans. And the part I care about, 3.2, going into land. All right. So when we look at these fluxes, and you can look at the carbon budget of the Harvard forest, it is pulling down carbon. And this is very good news for us, because basically what this means is that the biosphere is buffering climate change. Were it not for we would have twice as much carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere if it weren't for this process. Right? And so one of the big questions is, will this continue? Is the terrestrial biosphere starting to saturate with respect to its ability to take up carbon, and so on? And the last thing I'll point out here is land is particularly important because land is only 1/3 of the ocean of the total surface of the planet, but it's taking up more than the oceans. Okay? And there's a lot more variability because of things like disturbance, droughts, all that kind of stuff. All right, so that sort of sets the stage. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to transition to this study. We did a couple, it's about a decade ago, but it sort of links to some of the things I've already been talking about. All right, so here's the Keeling curve. I'm sure we're all familiar with this. These are measurements of atmospheric CO2 concentrations collected at about 12,000 feet in Mauna Loa in Hawaii, close to the equator, up in the mid-troposphere, well mixed, far away from industrial sources. Right, a pretty good fingerprint of what's going on. And so what I'd like to just point out here is this is the year, and I acknowledge I'm no longer useful, but this is the year I was born, right? Relative to pre-industrial, we had increased concentration of CO2 by about 15%, right? This is the year I was hired at BU, right? So 30 years later, it's up to 27% increase. And then this is last week, I just pulled this from the NOAA website last week, 53% increase. And so, we all know this, right, as geographers and people that are interested in global change science, but it's still kind of frightening to actually think about and to recognize, right? And so we need to be worried about this. So you'll notice in addition to the increase, there's also this sawtooth pattern, right? And that sawtooth pattern is the northern hemisphere biosphere. Northern hemisphere has a lot more land mass than the southern hemisphere. And so every season when spring comes, leaves come out, pulls carbon out of the atmosphere, goes down and up. What you can't see is that oscillation is not particularly constant. All right, so this is kind of a complicated plot. I'll spend a couple of minutes on it. But anyone who's spent time in my lab knows that I'm kind of obsessed. This is a paper that Heather Graven published in Science. And to me, this is just one of the most remarkable empirical studies that I've ever read. All right, so what are we looking at here? We're looking at two elevations in the atmosphere, 500 millibars, 700 millibars, 6 or 7 kilometers up, maybe 3 kilometers up in the atmosphere. Okay. We're looking at time, January, April, July, October, and we're looking at latitudinal bands, right? And then we've got two sets of data. One, the black points, are data that were collected around 1960, around the time I was born, as part of the International Geophysical Year, and they flew planes, and they went pole to pole, they went up and down, and they sampled the atmosphere. And so you can see over the course of the year, you can see that the sawtooth pattern that I just described. Oh, and by the way, these are all detrended, so it's basically putting a line through those plots. And we've removed the trend, they removed the trend. they then repeated, not they, but a different set of scientists, Ralph Keeling and a bunch of other folks at UC Scripps, repeated these measurements 50 years later in 2010. And so what you can see here is that the amplitude has changed. Right? This is the amplitude as a function of latitude. This is the difference between peak and trough around 1960. That's the difference in 2010. And so to me, this is it's just a remarkable result showing the biosphere is changing. That's, we've increased this seasonal amplitude by 50% in response to climate change. Okay, so it's just kind of a stunning empirical result. Very simple. They didn't really explain it. In fact, they said quite clearly, we don't really know where this is coming from. They did say they did some sort of simple atmospheric inverse modeling to say, as far as we can tell, this is coming from the temperate zone and the high latitudes, but beyond that, we don't know what's going on. So coincidentally, one of the co-authors on that paper, a guy named Eric Court, was actually visiting BU, and we went out to dinner. I don't know, it was like maybe a month or two after the paper came out, and we were chatting over dinner, and we came up with this hypothesis that maybe part of the story here is actually agriculture. All right, so if anyone has ever looked at global agriculture, this is an old map from 2010 that we built 15 years ago, but it kind of tells a story. This shows you the global distribution and intensity of croplands based on satellite. Not perfect, but it gives you the basic idea. If you look at available lands, if you actually include rangelands and exclude the ice sheets, Antarctica and Greenland, it's something like 35 to 40% of the land area is used for some type of agriculture. Okay? And so we sort of pose this question, or pose this hypothesis: has intensification of agriculture contributed to this change that Graven et al. saw? Okay, so, literally the next day I went down to, this is Josh Gray, who's now, I know I'm old because some of my former postdocs are now tenured faculty. It's a little embarrassing, but Josh, he's on the faculty at North Carolina State, but at the time he was a postdoc with me, and I said, we've got this idea, and he just took it and ran with it. So what I'm showing you here, we actually had I'm not going to go into, we had spatially explicit maps of crop production over time. All right, and so what I'm showing you are latitudinal zones of the four big crops: maize, wheat, soy, and rice, which are about 80% of commodity crop production on the planet. Maize, rice, soybeans, wheat. Maize, wheat, rice, soybeans, right? In 1965 versus 2005, and you can see the difference. Right, production is ramped up, and kind of the remarkable thing is that this is not expansion. This is purely crop management, irrigation, fertilizers, hybridization. This is why I say steroids, right? We're kind of putting, and like I was talking to John the other day about, I've driven through the Midwestern United States many times at this point, but if you go to the Midwestern United States right now, this zone over here, right? Has anyone ever been there? Summertime?
I'm from there.
Oh, you're from there, so you know, right? The corn stalks, they're this far apart, miles upon miles of corn, this far apart, and by the end of the season, they're 10, 12 feet high. We used to have the Landsat Science Team meetings in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I swear to God, by the beginning and the end of the week, you could actually see the corn grow. It's just unbelievable. So anyway, sorry. So we were able to map this. So these are changes in production, and I apologize for the cartography. I'd never like Josh. I could never get Josh to move away from this cartography, but good enough. It's okay. Gets the point across. This is change in production, and through some fairly basic algebra, you can turn that production into what we call delta S, which convert to carbon, either sequestration or emissions. The contribution to this change in seasonality in the atmospheric CO2, right? And so net, this is the change over time, right? This is the contribution by different crops: maize, darkest, wheat, lightest, and this is the geography. All right, so long story short, conservative, we estimated that about 17 to 25% of that change in seasonality was just due to agriculture, changes in agriculture, which is, we called the title of the paper was a direct human influence on atmospheric CO2 seasonality from increased cropland productivity. So again, it's sort of just another signature of human activity on the chemistry of the atmosphere, right? And then a couple other key factoids out of this. 88% from two places, Midwestern United States and China, basically the North China Plain, and then 2/3 of it, one crop. It's kind of a frightening statement about our ability to engineer crops. Okay, so that's great. But what about the other, anywhere from 75 to 83% of this? Right? And so I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit now. This is a figure from Zhu et al. From Science Advances, where they looked at accumulation of biomass in plants. It was this model-based, remote sensing-based study. And you can see a lot of where you can see loss. There's the whole ring of deforestation, right? Growth in the tropics of Africa. Here's all the oil palm in Asia and all this kind of stuff, right? But most of the landmass is in the northern hemisphere, and a lot of activity in high latitude. So I'm going to switch gears now to focus on some high latitude work we've been doing for the last little while. Okay, and so just to sort of set things up, these were results that were published. I can never get this name correct. Rantanen et al. In 2022. And so what we're showing you here, these are from different combination of just empirical data sets and analysis data sets. This is the trend in global temperatures, right? These light colors, and then they fit a linear line, right? A linear fit to the data from 1980 to 2022. These are the same data, or same thing, but at high latitudes. And so what this is showing is that high latitudes are warming about 4 times the rate the rest of the planet. And there's a variety of reasons for that. This so-called, what's called Arctic amplification. There are changes in circulation. There's things going on in the stratosphere. There's changes in albedo. But no matter how you slice it, things are changing really rapidly at high latitudes. And what that's leading to are some pretty dramatic changes. All right, so this is from Byrne et al. A couple of years ago, last year, I guess, in Nature. And they did a study looking at, I don't know whether you guys noticed or were paying attention or where, but the fire season in 2023 in Canada was crazy, right? So this is cumulative precip in 2023 relative to the previous 23 years. This is temperature relative to the previous 23 years. This is vapor pressure deficit, how dry the atmosphere is. And this is emissions of CO, carbon monoxide, which is one of the byproducts of forest fires, and CO. 10 times the previous 20 years. And so it's kind of starting to be a bit of a new normal for us, right? But just for reference, these are just, I wouldn't worry too much about this. I just included the total emissions from the fires in Canada that year were the same as the annual emissions, fossil fuel emissions from India. Previous years. So there's big stuff happening at high latitudes. Among those, I like this figure from Nate McDowell published in Science. So we're seeing, as I'll describe it, from accelerated disturbance regimes, more fires. And so what this is leading to, slowly but surely we believe, is fundamental changes in the structure and composition of forests. We're going from older, taller stature forests to younger, shorter stature forests. And then the other thing, this is a really nice graphic from Xanthi Walker's paper in Ecosystems. There's a strong connection, so particularly in boreal forests, but particularly in Canada, which are dominated by black spruce, these are ecosystems that they are evolved to burn, right? Fire is natural. But there's something a little bit different that appears to be going on, which is, as John will tell you, a lot of these forests, boreal forests in Canada, actually live on organic soils, right? And one of the things that's happening is if you get really large fires, they burn the organic soils, and the spruce need those soils to regenerate. It's part of their recovery process, and if they burn too much, they don't come back. And so what we believe is happening is that there's sort of two kind of pathways. Normal pathway, burns, invasive, the pioneer species are the sort of deciduous species, but they eventually get out-competed by the conifers, or in the case of severe fires, they just never come back. And the thing about the deciduous forests is they also tend to be a little bit wetter, they don't burn, and so it leads to a state change. So we've been doing a bunch of work. NASA tends to do these sort of concentrated focus studies on sort of decadal timescales. And so for the last decade, the sort of focus has been this thing called the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. And so it's a field modeling and remote sensing based program to basically try and look at change in this pretty big chunk of real estate in northwestern North America. I think it's like the core region is about 3.2 million square kilometers. And so we've done a bunch of work on this, looking at two kind of core things. How is the distribution of land and forest cover changing, right, in response to some of these processes I'm talking about, and how is that propagating into the carbon budget? And this is all work that was done by a PhD student of mine, John Wang, who's now an assistant professor at University of Utah. All right, so we use remote sensing to do this. I'm going to briefly describe this method called the continuous change detection and classification algorithm, which was pioneered by a couple of colleagues, Curtis Woodcock and his student Juja at Boston University. In very simple terms, that this is sort of a cartoon, right? We've got satellites flying over, we get repeated observations, and we fit very simple harmonic regressions. Maybe two harmonics, I can't remember whether two or three harmonics. And the idea is when it's stable, we can fit a single model, right? There's a change, there's a sort of simple statistical test for breakpoint, and then we get a new, what we call a time segment, where we fit a new model. And that's reflective of, in this case, very simple cartoon version, evergreen forest, fire, afterwards we have shrub coming in, and then some type of a successional process. This is all from Landsat, using the Landsat record that I described before, 30 meters, 30 to 40 years worth of data. All right. To do this, we use supervised classification. In other words, John spent 6 months of his life creating a massive data set, which we use high-res imagery from Digital Globe, for those of you that are familiar with this, commercial, but we had access to it through NASA. John spent some time in the field. I put a picture of John with a wetland behind him for John's sake. And then we collected, basically collaborators contributed a ton of data. And we built a massive database of representative samples. And from that, you build maps, and you make annual maps. And so this is just to give you an example. This is in British Columbia. You can see here's the location down here. 30 years worth of change, and I don't know if anyone's flown over the west coast of North America, but it's a really heavily managed forest ecosystem, and you can just see the patchwork, all these yellow spots that are popping up. That's timber harvest, right? And so that gives you kind of a sense at sort of a local scale of, it's not perfect, but it's pretty remarkable what we can pull out of the Landsat record in these places. And so what John did was, and this was a ton of processing, this is tens of terabytes of data and many hours of processing. He ran it over the whole area. I don't have time to talk about it. We also, one of the things we try to do, one of the things I like to say is it's really easy in remote sensing to make a bad map, right? And many people do. We put a lot of emphasis on, we collected a large set of reference cases, so we actually have statistically robust uncertainties on this earth. But long story short, this red here is showing loss of forest cover, particularly conifer forests. Right? And what we see is that this is being balanced by increase in deciduous forests and shrub. And so I think it was about a 7 or 8 or 10, I should have looked this up, I'm sorry, 10% change in conifer cover. Not huge, but not nothing for a 30-year period, right? And so it's sort of the strong evidence here of a kind of a start of a systematic shift in the plant functional composition of these forests, right? And if you look at it, here's the map. Both Canada and Alaska have very detailed, they make very detailed and high quality fire maps. You can see the patterns of the fires, different colors for different time periods. It's basically fire that's driving this process. Okay, so one question is, well, is this continuing and what about the rest of North America? Right, and so this is Kai-Ting Hu, one of my current PhD students. She's done a really nice job continuing this, and the simple answer is we see the same pattern. Right, so we've extended the time series to 2020, 36 years, and you can see the exact same pattern extending here. Right, all the red is loss of conifer cover, and this blue, we're seeing increase in deciduous tree cover. So basically what we're seeing is in the southern range of boreal forest, where the climate is a little bit more hospitable, we're seeing the deciduous trees coming in and replacing the conifers, and then up here they're just kind of going away and being replaced by lower stature trees. Right, and then this kind of says the same thing. This is just showing you the time series. You can see area-wise how dominant the conifers are, and if we start losing them, it's kind of a big deal. And you can see the increase in deciduous and shrubs. Nominally, we're seeing about a 10% decrease in ENF, the evergreen needleleaf forest, about a 22% increase in deciduous broadleaf, and about a 17. So it's a pretty big shift. There's pretty strong evidence we're seeing a systematic shift in the plant functional type composition of the North American boreal forest. And then the last part, which is kind of novel and new, this is a little bit hard to explain, so I'll do my best. We did this analysis, Kai-Ting did this analysis, kind of trading space per time. So these are, sorry you guys, I once had a colleague say to me after I gave a talk, he said, Mark, you give a great talk, but you walk around too much. So forgive me if I'm walking around too much. These are these ecoregions, just to sort of see how things are varying geographically. So what Kai-Ting did was she took each of them, and then she looked at the composition directly before fires. Okay? And so dark green is evergreen needleleaf, light green, deciduous broadleaf, herbaceous, yellow, shrub green, and so on. Okay? So the first column on each of these guys is telling you basically proportionally how much of each of these plant functional types in each of these ecoregions. And then these guys are doing the same thing, but only selecting pixels. Oh, I'm jet lagged, don't I? Need some sleep. At time increments after fire. Right? So this is kind of the recovery pattern after fire in those ecoregions. And so what you can see is for several of these guys, if you just compare here and here, that's beginning, that's after 60 years beginning, they're coming back fine. But for several of them, and these guys are the big ones, area-wise, they're not coming back and they're being replaced by deciduous forests. So it's very consistent with this hypothesis of the sort of climate change and disturbance altering the plant functional type composition, and it's also consistent with a bunch of high-profile field-based studies, so that's kind of reassuring. All right, and then the last thing is we looked at the sort of a classic biogeographic analysis. These are, for those of you that are familiar, these are Whitaker plots looking at the bioclimatic envelopes of sort of for generalized biomes as a function of mean annual temperature and rainfall. This is the zone where we're losing conifers, and you can see it's unsurprisingly on the drier end. That's where the fires are going to happen, but also, and then here's where the deciduous trees are coming in, and to some degree, a little bit warmer, a little bit wetter, out competing the conifers. All right. Changing gears a little bit. Did not mean to leave this slide in, sorry. Lasers in space. So far I've been talking about ways to measure two-dimensional changes over time. The other thing that's really emerged in the last few years, a very exciting dimension, new dimension of remote sensing, is the ability to measure the three-dimensional structure of ecosystems. This has been around for a while on aircrafts. These instruments called LiDARs, light detection and ranging. It's basically like a radar, but it's using different wavelengths. It's basically visible and near infrared. So it's a laser. Pointing a laser, seeing what comes back. And what you can get out of that is, from an individual shot, you get what's called a waveform. And that gives you the vertical structure of biomass at a given location. And so here's a transect from the aircraft. So you can see a pretty detailed transect of variability in height and variability in basically branch and leaf area within the canopy. Okay? So foresters and silviculturists have for many years known that if you know something about the structure, you can actually compute biomass from that. So what John did, working with another former student, Alessandro Bacchini, who's kind of pioneered some of this stuff, is we used data from this instrument called GLASS. So we now have two spaceborne LiDARs, but that's a relatively new thing. One is on ICESat, it's a laser altimeter, it's primarily focused on ice sheets, and the other is this thing called JEDI, which is on the space station. And that's specifically designed for us. Neither of those were available when we were doing this work. Right? So what we use is we use data from ICESat-1, Geoscience Laser Altimeter, designed for ice sheets. Right? These are great instruments for looking at the mass balance of ice sheets because they really high precision can measure the height of the ice sheets and how they're changing. So you can back of the ice. But they also collected data over land. Right? So that's great for us. Not designed for vegetation, but it turns out there's a fair amount of information there for us. And so there's these transects giving us tens of thousands of measurements of basically this, right, which Alessandro then used to convert into every one of these points as a point measurement estimate of the above ground biomass, right? And what John did is he took that, he linked it with this Landsat time series I just showed you. That allows you to spatialize these points. You get wall-to-wall maps. And it allows you, assuming those relationships are stable, then you can then reconstruct the time series over time. So from these points, we make a map of above-ground biomass. How much carbon is stored in the trees at any given 30-meter pixel. All right, and so here's the exact same site. And you can see undisturbed forest, not super high carbon density, about 135. These are tons per hectare, right? And anytime there's a clearing, they go to zero. And so we can actually track this over time. All right, and so I should probably, how am I doing for time here?
You're good, you're good.
Huh?
You're good.
5 minutes? Okay.
Depends on much discussion.
Jeez.
No. So
I've got a captive
10,
audience
15
here.
is fine.
Okay, well, I'll try to, how about if I try for 10? But I'm going to have to accelerate here. So, long story short, we can use this to measure across time net change in carbon storage above ground. Got to be clear, it's only above ground. And in this case, despite all this clearing, net, we get positive, mostly from growth in undisturbed areas. Take the same thing over the whole area, and we can compute basically the above bound carbon budget over time. All right, so if we look at this, right, this is what it looks like. You see net, about 434 teragrams of carbon accumulation in the boreal in the study region over this 30-year period, but you can see the impact. These are big fire years in here. right? And so these big fire years are starting to kick in and really limit the ability of these forests to accumulate carbon. All right, and just to be clear, large uncertainties again, 434 plus or minus nearly 50%, and above ground only. Okay. The other interesting thing that John did here was, for those of you that are familiar with CMIT, Coupled Model and Comparison Project, these are the models that go into the IPCC reports, right? And these are what we're using to forecast future climates. And they're really really difficult to work with because they're all in different formats and not very well sort of harmonized. But John took the 26 models. They have to simulate terrestrial carbon budgets to do the climate system. And so here's what, for the same study region, here's what John got. This is what these models are. So if you believe John's result, I'm biased, but I would do, but I do believe it, their median, there's a large range. They're overestimating the amount of carbon sequestration by threefold, which is a lot, right? Those models are sequestering a lot of carbon. The question is why? Do they do harvest? No, they don't really do harvest. Fire, I'll show you not so well in a second. And then the other thing is this notion of CO2 fertilization. CO2 is food for plants, in very simple terms, right? And they all have some kind of a parameterization for the way that trees are picking up carbon. All right? So here's the record. This is the area, burned area, across from 1940 to 2020, according to historical record from Canadian and Alaskan fire databases. For the 26 models, only 5 actually include any treatment for fire, which is kind of stunning, and they don't capture the trend, right? So there's one model that's kind of all over map, it's CSM2, but the rest of them are all down here. So bottom line, and in some senses, this may be the most important part of this paper, which is to just inform the modeling community that they need to get fire into these models and they need to do a much better job because as we already talked about, fire is a big deal. All right, I'll do the last part quickly. And this is more data product generation anyway, there's less science to talk about, but we've been working on this project for about 7 years now, this thing called GLANCE, Global Land Cover Mapping and Estimation. The idea is to take the Landsat record and build a global record over 30 years at 30 meter spatial resolution for land cover and land cover change over the planet. Okay. We're working very hard, as I keep saying, to characterize the uncertainty of these maps. It's really easy to make bad maps, and it's really easy to make maps that don't have any quantified uncertainty, and it's just no longer, we can't do that anymore, right? So we're compiling validation data, we're trying to distribute these data sets, including the reference in the training data, and we're trying to distribute open source tools. And there's been a large team. Curtis Woodcock is a longtime collaborator. Paulo Aurelio and Yintong Zhang have both worked very hard on this. Still work in progress. It's super simple. We're doing super simple classifications. We've got 2 levels. We've got to start out with. This has turned out to be much harder than we thought it was going to be. We thought it was going to be pretty easy, and to do it well, and we're trying to do it well. It's taking us a long time. So we're just starting with 7 classes. You can see them: snow, ice, developed, bare, water, forest, herbaceous shrubs. We're collecting data, and at some point we will expand the forest to include leaf type and phenology, and hopefully distinguish sort of natural herbaceous lands from agriculture. We're doing staggered release. The big challenge here, this is kind of it's a simple but a complicated one. This is what the Landsat archive looks like over years, right? And so the colors is telling you in different time periods the number of annual observations after you filter for clouds and snow, basically the usable data, right? And so different time periods, really sketchy early in the record. There was no, USGS, who's responsible for collecting and archiving, they had no systematic plan for collect. They just randomly collected data. It's kind of weird. With the launch of Landsat 7, they started systematic collections. Gets a little bit better, and you can see with Landsat 8, which had much larger capacity, the measurements or the collections are systematic and much denser. They're able to collect a lot more data. But here's the point I'm getting at. You look at places like West Africa, right? It's a desert. Siberia, it's really bad. And so so what we're dealing with is how to build these models and methods with really, really variable density and data quality, depending on where you are. We had a small army of undergraduate students and master's students who probably went through several dozen new eyeglass prescriptions, interpreting imagery. I don't even know what the number is now. I'm going to say it's 150,000 points that we've built worldwide, and then that's supplemented by, we've had a lot of collaborators. Some of you may be familiar with Matt BMS, GeoWiki, who have contributed data as well. Have been really, really pretty generous. It's a very, very large training. Apparently these models can never have enough data. It's kind of remarkable. And then this is really important. We're doing probability samples for the reference data so we can get really good estimates of the uncertainty on our maps. All right, so I'm going to accelerate because I know I'm out of time here, but just to show you, I'm just going to show you some really quick examples of what we got. So here's South America. The upper panel is a region in Colombia, and so this is a time series. This is 2014, and we go back to the beginning in a second here, right? You can see, so this is a good news story. Right, you can see expansion. Green is forest, yellow is herbaceous. So we're seeing actually regrowth of forests here. This is Rondonia, right? And so, in addition to being depressing, you can actually see the sort of the fidelity and the integrity with which these instruments can actually map this stuff. It's pretty good. And these are some basic accuracy. It's not perfect, but for those of you that know anything about remote sensing, once you hit 80% accuracy, you're kind of like, okay, we're good. And then here, same thing, but you can see the whole continent, right? And it is kind of remarkable, right? See the loss of forest cover in South America over a 20-year period, right? This whole arc of deforestation from Brazil down into Bolivia and the Chaco and Argentina, it's kind of, I don't know, I guess it's horrifying. Here's North America. You can see this is not, the graphics not, this is in sort of industrial forestry in southern Oregon. This is an area around an airport in and around Tampa, and you can see the expansion of red is sort of urbanization and developed. You can see the expansion after the airport comes in. Here's an area adjacent to the Nile in Egypt. You can see expansion of urban areas. This is an area in Mozambique, and you can see a couple things. You can see, I think this is, oh boy, my African geography, so I think this is the Zambezi River. Anyone know? Okay, nobody can tell me I'm wrong, so I'm going to go with it. But you can see how dynamic the river is, and you can also see changes in the forest cover up and around over here. It's pretty cool. You should go from that. And then I think the last one is, this is Istanbul, and you'll see around 2013, the bridge goes in over the Bosphorus. You can see all the development that happens as an outcome of that bridge. Okay. So we're, this is my last slide. So one last thing. In addition, these are the basic things. So we've actually released a bunch of these data. We're doing them continent by continent. We've done South America, North America, Europe, Oceania. We're currently working on Africa and Eurasia. Eurasia being a small piece of real estate. But in addition to the stuff I talked about, we're also including these other metrics, which are, this is EDI, is a vegetation index. It's basically telling you changes in sort of the greenness. Seasonality is a green. So we're trying to include some additional information related to sort of ecological state of the landscapes. All right, so I'm not a big fan of summary slides, so I don't have a summary slide because you're just saying the same things you've already said. But I hope what I kind of convince you of is that we have this kind of wealth wealth of information and a time series of information that's characterizing the planet in an era of really kind of remarkable and rapid change. And as geographers, I don't think there's anyone better suited to study these types of processes. Humans are driving the bus, and we're driving it kind of off the cliff, and so we need geographers to kind of help us figure this stuff out. So I will stop there with these beautiful images of our home planet from this instrument that I worked on for many years called Modicine. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you
Don't want to
very
get
much.
between anyone and wine and food, right? It's a bad strategy.
You had me so engrossed in the talk that I didn't. I was being a very
Now that you
bad
mention
chair.
it, though.
But and I got the time wrong when you asked me. So,
Okay.
but it was absolutely fantastic and really interesting to see that. I mean, the amount of work that goes into producing that type of quality-controlled, validated, with the uncertainty bands quantified imagery is amazing, and so I think it's just goes to show what the individual time.
This panel I was on where we reviewed the sort of they call it the senior review to continue the missions. It was incredibly intimidating because it was literally $500 million in funding, and we each had to review like 3 proposals, each 100 pages long, but it was far and away the coolest thing. I mean, just to hear the engineers come in and talk about all the stuff they do to keep the instruments running and orbiting, and it's just really impressive.
Yeah. So I think what your talk also illustrated really well is the power of the end result. That
Hope so.
So I would have a question on that, but I'm going to give the audience the floor first. So are there any? Yeah.
Thank you, great talk. At the start, you went through all the satellites, and I noticed that the methane satellite, wasn't listed. And it just launched last year.
Yep.
I'm interested in how, any data that might come from that. I know it's not quite historical or isn't as much seasonality from that, but how that might kind of inform any assumptions and the overlay of that information on the use change. And is that going to be factored in?
It's a really good question. I know the PI, I don't know if it's the PI, but Steve Wassey over at Harvard is heavily involved in that. As far as I know, they haven't released any data, and so nobody knows. But it's, it's super important because among the greenhouse gases, methane is extremely powerful, and we really have very poor information on how much it's
One year.
So, but I don't, you know as much as I do. I heard through the grapevine that they had some issues with the satellites. I also heard from that they couldn't communicate. This is the problem with satellite. The cliche is space is hard, but I heard initially they couldn't contact, they couldn't communicate. But I think they fixed it. I heard they fixed it, but nobody knows. I'm sorry, I wish I could. Yes.
I was just curious, with the increasing amount of data, sheer amount, are you seeing already that, is processing keeping up and the ability to deal with the data, or I'm just curious on your perspective of seeing it over all this time? I'm thinking of like LiDAR data, and if you're trying to get from space, just the sheer mass.
Volume?
Yes.
Yeah.
Anything you wanted to speak on that?
I can give you a very American response, is it depends on how much money you have, right? So far, it's okay, I think. But it depends. Like at BU, we have a really good high-performance compute facility, so we do a lot of work on our high-performance compute facility. But to do what we do, like I think right now my group, we have 400 or 500 terabytes on spinning disk, and we can access hundreds of cores to process the data simultaneously. A lot of people have moved to Earth Engine, which I have kind of mixed feelings about, because it's great because the data is all there. But I find it limiting as a data science platform, and I was having this conversation, I worry that Google could just change their mind right? And turn it off. Because one thing I do know is, to Google's credit, they are spending easily tens of millions, or they are foregoing tens of millions of dollars annually in CPU and that they're deploying. So, I don't know, is that really an answer to your question? I don't know. We're okay because we have the compute facilities, and Earth Engine has been a huge boon to the community, but so one of the instruments that's going up this year is NISAR, which is a radar, a dual band radar, and the data volumes that are going to come off of that, it's like order of magnitude higher. So we're drinking from the fire hose. So.
Thanks.
Yes?
Thanks, Mark. That was really fascinating, fantastic stuff. I'm interested in what we can say about biodiversity from measurement sense products, and it seems like the LiDAR data might be particularly useful.
Yeah.
But there's also, I mean, we're involved in modelling how land use affects biodiversity, for example, so I can definitely see the use of those more detailed products that you have there for enabling us to kind of model how biodiversity might respond. Maybe the LiDAR and there's a connection between vegetation structure, for example, and species richness and diversity, which could be exploited here potentially.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, what's the biggest source of biodiversity loss? It's people cutting out forests, right? So we're hoping, it was one of the justifications for this last project I was talking about that will be useful to folks like yourself. But yeah, absolutely. I didn't talk about it a lot, but this instrument called JEDI, which is the Global Ecosystems Dynamics Investigation, it's a long story. Actually, the PI, the principal investigator, was a lab mate of mine in grad school, and Ralph has devoted his entire career to getting us LiDAR in space, and he's had 2 projects canceled on him for a variety of reasons, but he finally got this thing up, and it's a really, really beautiful instrument, and that is one of the things that people are using it for, and there's a number of studies that are starting to show up now that are linking the optical with the LiDAR, the 3-dimensional structure, they're basically, at least at an empirical level, starting to show those types of linkages. And then the other thing, as we discussed at lunch, is hyperspectral. Right? That's kind of the holy grail for the biodiversity community, is being able to actually identify species-specific signatures from these really fine spectral signatures that you're going to get from. I mean, Landsat has basically 6 spectral bands, but NASA's building something called surface biology and geology, which is both geology and biology. I think it's going to be on order of 400 bands, right? And so that will be kind of transformative for the biodiversity. But we got to wait. In the meantime, there's aircraft. Like there's aircraft data being collected.
There's another question behind Tim.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. One of the things which struck me was the projection. Geography talks first and foremost about area and size.
Yep.
And recently I've been reading stuff about case work on projection. And one of them actually transposes Mexico and Greenland. Now, my question is, I was wondering whether in presentations like this, it matters what the projection of the world which is used.
Geography question.
Great question.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a variant of what I said before. It's really easy to make bad maps, right? And do you all still teach cartography here?
No.
Not enough.
Yeah, I mean, I took cartography as an undergraduate, but we don't teach it anymore. And I don't really have a great answer for you, but I do know that the way that storytelling and the way that you convey information, and maps are an extremely powerful way of doing that, matter a lot. And whether you use a different projection, you get very different perspectives and interpretations of maps. So I don't know, it's kind of a non-answer. I apologize, but maybe my answer is I agree. Right? But yeah.
Just to maybe take a quick point on that, we have every projection on our notes board. Yeah, and it's a very unusual projection, but really challenges.
Yeah.
And visitors that come to the museum building we get talking to them, and they're like, everything is in the wrong place. And you're like, really? So it's quite, if you want to have a look out there on our notice board, you can have a look at that map. It's very interesting.
The MODIS instrument that I talked about earlier, which is a global imager, it was really transformative for the community. But one of the things that people complained bitterly about was they released the data in a sinusoidal projection. I don't know if you remember this, John. But it was like people just, and the reason they did it is because it's equal area. All the pixels were the same size, right? But boy, you get these represent the whole thing will just be weird looking, and people couldn't figure it out. So it definitely matters. Took the community about 5 years to figure it out. Yes.
I was picking up on when you were talking about the continuous change detection other C model, where you're showing the piecewise, almost harmonic models for the change pre and post intervention. I know you're talking a lot about fire and deforestation, but in Ireland, of course, I'm one of the peat people. I'm curious whether or not there's an expansion that you could look at instead of just fire intervention. You could look at a peat cutting intervention with that similar type of model, or has that already been done?
Oh no, I mean, in theory. So 2 comments. Curtis Woodcock and a student developed this. Curtis is really interested in forests. Right? So, and it works best for forests because it's a pretty profound change, and many forests have a nice seasonality. You can fit those in. But in theory, it should. If there's it really depends on if there's a strong enough signature of change. But in theory, yeah, it's designed to be a generic change, cover and change back and
So could you use those? Thank you for the talk. Amazing. Could you use that same theory, say, if you're looking at like a pre and post storm on a coastal environment?
Yeah, we use. So I currently have a project with a coastal geomorphologist, and we're looking at the impact of sea level rise on coastal systems all along North America, and we're using the same tool, and we can see the impact of individual storms. There's a definite signature in the time series from individual storms, so for sure.
Yeah, so I just thought it was really interesting about the change in the land coverage from coniferous needle-based to deciduous broadleaf.
Yep.
Do we have any idea of the, biodiversity impacts, but the wider consequences of this change as it happens?
Yeah, I didn't really talk. I mean, the big thing in terms of what I was talking about is they have very different carbon and energy values. Right? Deciduous forests tend to be more productive, and they have a higher albedo. So the good news there is that from a sort of a climate feedback perspective, that would actually, you would expect that to be a negative feedback. It should be cooling and it should pull more carbon out of the ground. So that's the good news. The other dimension we should be clear on, there's this whole other part of the boreal forest in Eurasia that we don't look at. And there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of fire going on there. And part of the issue there is that if you saw my slide, the Landsat record there is really, really poor. And for the last 5 to 10 years, it's been really, really hard to find Russian collaborators to help us with this stuff. It's kind of unfortunate. But it's a really, really big chunk of the landscape that I don't know what's happening.
So I might just follow that up because that's an interesting thing that occurred to me during your talk about permafrost induced changes to the vegetation cover.
Yep.
And how does that play into the
signatures of change
story and the other controls on
Yeah, I mean there's it's happening. The signature of change is much slower. You will see these sort of forest slumps where the trees are just kind of falling over. We've tried to look at it. I have a colleague at the University of Montreal named Oliver Sonnentag, and he keeps nagging me about this, but it's just too slow and not quite large enough a signal for us to pick up at this point. It's something we'll probably pick up within maybe another decade, because it's definitely happening. I mean, Oliver talks about, he goes to his field site every year, and it's like it's progressed another meter. But you know, progressing a meter when we've got 30 meter pixels it's just too subtle for us to see. But it's yeah, there's a lot of carbon stored in permafrost too.
And that's the problem we have at the coast as well, with the 30 meter pixel.
Yeah, right.
You have a line instead of an area.
You know, you may have heard of this company, Planet. We've tried using Planet. The problem with Planet is, I call them iPhones in space. I mean, it's literally this technology with a telescope and a color filter. I mean, they've improved the instruments now, but the data is not great. It's not really 3 meter data. It's more like 5 or 7 meter data. They just oversample it. But you know, those sources are going to continue to get better. It's just you got to pay for it, right? This is one of our challenges. Is that, you know, the building and flying satellites is very capital intensive, and there's no history of anyone succeeding without basically having to leverage defense budgets to pay for it. That's how that's how Planet survives, that's how Maxar survives, that's how Airbus survives. And so they just don't, there's just not, we can't afford to pay for it, and there's just not enough data where we want it.
I'm not going to bring our mood down by referring to some entrepreneurs who have a hell of a lot of money and are in influential political positions at the moment.
Yes.
Shoot all sorts of things up in space.
He who shall not be named.
So thank you so much for all your engagement and the wonderful questions. And Mark, particularly to you for coming over here. We have a little